Dust Creek, the American West. 1876. The saloon is thick with smoke. Clara walks straight in, eyes locked on the sheriff at the far end of the room. She stops. 3 feet. Her voice doesn't shake. You have something that belongs to me. My husband's land deed, the one you took, the night you killed him. Kincaid sets his bourbon down slow. Real slow. The smile of a man who's already won, Mrs. Dalton. You just walked into the wrong saloon. The kick comes fast. Clara hits the floor, hard blood on her lip, sawdust against her cheek, and every man in that room looks away. Not one of them moves. Then the sound of spurs on the boardwalk. Slow. Steady. Deliberate. The doors fly open. Afternoon sun pours in like a flood. A silhouette fills the framed dark hat, long duster. One hand resting near a holster, like it's the most natural place in the world. Who is he, and how far is one woman willing to go to take back everything that was stolen from her in a town that's chosen silence over justice? Stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens next. The doors of the saloon swung open, and nobody looked up. That was the first thing Clara noticed. A woman walks into a room, and nobody moves, nobody turns. A dozen men sitting at tables, drowning in whiskey and cigarette smoke, and not one of them had the decency to acknowledge she was there. She walked in anyway. Her boots clicked against the warped floorboards. Her chin was up. Her dress was dusty from the road. Her hair pulled back tight, but her eyes were steady, sharp, like a woman who had already decided how this was going to go. The man she was looking for sat at the far end of the room, Sheriff Hale Kincaid. He was a big man, the kind of big that fills a doorframe and knows it. He had a thick mustache and cold, lazy eyes, and he was leaning back in his chair with a glass of bourbon, watching her walk toward him like she was the most amusing thing he'd seen all week. She stopped 3 feet from his table. You have something that belongs to me, she said. Her voice was calm. Controlled. My husband's land deed. The one you took the night he died. A beat of silence. Then Kincaid smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile a man gives when he's already won and wants you to know it. He set down his glass slowly, very slowly, like he had all the time in the world. And both of them would end when he decided. Mrs. Dalton. He said her name like it tasted funny. Your husband's land deed. Now why would I have that? Because you're a thief, Clara said, and a coward who steals from widows. The room went very quiet. Men shifted in their seats. Someone set down a glass carefully, like even that small sound might draw attention. Nobody stood up. Nobody spoke. They just waited. A room full of grown men, waiting to see what the big man would do next. Kincaid's smile didn't waver. He stood up slow. He was a full head taller than her. He let her feel that, let her look up at him. He walked around the table, unhurried, and stopped just close enough that she had to hold her ground or step back. She didn't step back, little woman, he said quietly. You walked into the wrong saloon. His boot came up fast. The kick caught her square in the ribs. Hard. The kind of blow meant to teach a lesson, not just hurt. Clara's breath left her body in a single, terrible rush. She went sideways. Her hip caught the edge of a table. She spun, she hit the floor. And she slid 3 feet across the filthy floorboards before she stopped. She lay there for a moment, dust and sawdust against her cheek, the smell of tobacco and stale beer soaking into her dress. Her ribs screamed. Every breath felt like swallowing glass. She pressed one hand flat against the floor and tried to push herself up. Her arms shook so badly she nearly went down again. Around her, nobody moved. Not one man stood. Not one chair scraped back. A young cowboy near the window was staring at the floor. An older man at the bar had turned back to his drink. A card game in the corner kept going, quiet and deliberate. Like a woman hadn't just been kicked across the room in front of them all. That's what broke her, not the pain. She could survive pain. It was the silence, the way a whole roomful of people could watch something wrong happen and choose, deliberately and without shame, to look away. That kind of cowardice has a cost, not just to the woman on the floor, to every man who stands by and says nothing. It costs them something they can't buy back, a piece of who they used to be, before they decided that keeping safe mattered more than doing right. Clara pressed her cheek against the floorboard. She tasted blood. Her vision blurred at the edges. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was barely anything. "Please, help me." Nothing. And then the saloon went absolutely still. Not the silence of men being careful. Something different. Something that changed the air itself. The cigarette smoke seemed to hold still. Even Kincaid stopped moving. There was a sound outside. Steady, rhythmic, the heavy, deliberate clink of iron spurs on the wooden boardwalk. Each step slow and even, like whoever it was had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. The swinging doors flew open hard. The afternoon sun poured in like a flood, burning white and blinding, filling the whole door frame with pure, flat light. For a moment there was nothing in it. Just light, then a silhouette, tall, perfectly still. The brim of a dark hat, the long fall of a duster coat, one hand loose at his side, the other resting near a holster with the ease of a man who had made that gesture so many times it had become his natural position, a place he returned to the way other men returned to prayer. He stepped inside. The light behind him softened and the man came into shape. Dark eyes that swept the room once, slow and complete, the way a man takes inventory. A jaw set hard, a face like something carved, and then left out in the weather for a great many years. Not young, not old, somewhere in between. In the place where hard living makes its home. Silas Thorne. Some men walk into a room and announce it. They want the attention. They need you to know they've arrived. Silas didn't want anything. He just walked, past the bar, past the tables, past the men who parted without being asked, stepping aside. The way water moves around, something that has its own weight. He didn't look at Kincaid. He didn't look at anyone. He looked at Clara. He crossed the room and crouched down beside her. His hands were rough and scarred and enormous. They were also somehow gentle when they reached under her. He lifted her like she weighed nothing at all, cradled her against his chest. Then he straightened up, and he looked at Kincaid. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. They said, "I see you. I know exactly what you are. And I am something you have never had the misfortune of meeting before." Kincaid's hand moved toward his gun. It stopped. Something in those eyes told him, clearly and without room for argument, that if he finished that motion, he wouldn't be finishing anything else. The room held its breath. Silas turned. He carried Clara out through the swinging doors and back into the blazing afternoon, and the doors settled shut behind him without a sound. In the dust and the smoke and the silence he left behind, not a single man moved. But some of them felt something stir, something they'd buried deep and hadn't touched in a long time. Shame has a way of finding you like that, quiet and right on time. Martha's boarding house was 2 blocks from the saloon and a world apart from it. It was a small, clean building with white-painted shutters and a window box of dried flowers that had somehow held their color through the summer heat. The kind of place a woman maintains on stubbornness alone when everything around her has gone to dust and rot. The sign above the door was painted in careful, neat letters. Everything about it said, "Someone cares about this place. Someone fights for it." Martha Hale met them at the door before Silas even knocked. She was a broad woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned back hard and flour still on her apron, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. She looked at Clara in Silas's arms. She looked at the bruising already rising along Clara's jaw. She looked at Silas. "Bring her inside," she said. That was all. She led them up the narrow staircase to a back room. Simple. A bed with a faded blue quilt, a washstand, a single candle on the sill. Martha was already moving before Silas had Clara settled. She disappeared down the hall and came back with a basin of hot water, clean cloth, a dark glass bottle of something that smelled like pine, and something sharper underneath. "Kincaid's going to hear about this," Silas said. A warning, not a threat. He wanted her to understand what she was walking into. Martha set the basin down on the washstand without looking at him. "Kincaid hears about everything in this town," she said. "Hasn't stopped me yet." She wrung out a cloth in the hot water and held it out to Clara. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about Martha. After years in a town like Dust Creek, steadiness wasn't something she had to try for anymore. It had become her natural state. The way certain trees grow harder when the wind hits them the most. Then she looked at Silas again, just briefly, and something passed between them. Something old and quiet, the kind of understanding that has no name because it's lived past the need for one. She touched his arm once, firm and brief, and walked out. The door stayed halfway open. The room felt smaller after she left. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the cloth. Her ribs ached with every breath. Her jaw throbbed where it had caught the floor. She pressed the cloth gingerly against a cut above her eyebrow and hissed through her teeth. Silas stood in the corner. It was the farthest point from the bed the room would allow, and he put himself there deliberately, hat still on, arms crossed, his eyes on the floor like it had something interesting to say. Clara tried to reach the worst of it, a cut on her left side, up under her rib cage, where she'd caught the corner of a table on the way down. She couldn't quite get the angle right. Her arms shook trying. She stopped, tried again. Her breath snagged on the pain, and she made a small sound she hadn't meant to make. One of those sounds that slips out before you can stop it. The kind that tells the honest truth when your face is still working hard to lie. Silas pushed off the wall. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched down in front of her. He picked up the cloth, wrung it out again in the basin. His hands were enormous, rough in the way that comes from years of work and weather, and things a man would rather not think about. He folded the cloth into a square and looked up at her. "May I?" he said. Not quite a question, more like a statement with space left in it for her to say no. She studied him for a moment. Then she shifted slightly and turned so he could reach the cut on her side. He worked carefully. That was the thing that surprised her. A man built like that, with hands like those. You'd expect force. You'd expect bluntness. Instead, he was precise, deliberate. He cleaned the wound without pressing, replaced the cloth when it cooled, applied the ointment from the bottle with 2 fingers, and a touch so light it was almost impossible to reconcile with the rest of him. The man who had walked into that saloon and frozen Kincaid with a look. The man whose reputation had driven grown men to cross the street. That same man was dabbing medicine onto her ribs like she was made of something breakable. Clara stared straight ahead, kept her breathing even, told herself to concentrate on something practical. The weave of the quilt, the sound of wind outside, anything. The proximity was its own kind of trouble. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. She could see the scar along the left side of his jaw, the exact places where the years had pressed themselves into his face and stayed, the calluses on his knuckles, the particular way his jaw stayed set, even when nothing threatening was happening, like his body had forgotten how to stand down. She noticed all of it, and she could tell, with a certainty she didn't entirely understand, that he was noticing none of her, or trying very hard to believe that he wasn't. His face stayed still and focused, task at hand. When he finished, he stood, moved back toward his corner, and put the distance between them again, the way a man does when he's been somewhere he has no business being. "You should go," he said. He didn't look at her. "There's a stagecoach out of Dust Creek Friday morning. You get on it." Clara pulled her sleeve down. "No," she said. "Ma'am, don't." Quiet but firm. "Don't say it like that. Like I'm someone who needs to be managed." He looked at her then, really looked. His dark eyes had something in them she couldn't quite place. Something tired and layered and careful. "Kincaid will kill you," he said. "What happened today in the saloon?" That was him being entertained. "He won't be entertained much longer. I know what he is, do you?" "My husband is dead," Clara said. She let the words sit there, flat and real. "He didn't die of sickness or old age. He was murdered for a piece of land we built with our hands. Land we earned, and Hale Kincaid has the deed to that land sitting in a safe somewhere. And he's in that saloon right now, with his boots up and his bourbon poured. And he believes that's the end of the story." She stood up slowly because of the ribs, but she stood all the way up. "It is not the end of the story," she said. "I am not leaving without what's mine." The room was very quiet. Silas looked at her for a long moment, Something moved in his face, too fast and too deep to name. Then he looked away. "Get some sleep," he said. He moved to the chair in the corner, settled into it, pulled his hat down over his eyes, and didn't say another word. Clara lay down on the bed and pulled the quilt up over herself. The candle on the windowsill burned low and then lower. Outside, the wind moved through the streets of Dust Creek in long, slow sweeps, the kind of wind that makes a town feel emptier than it already is. She stared at the ceiling. There are moments in a person's life when everything gets stripped away. The noise, the plans, the reassurances you've been feeding yourself to keep moving. And what's left is just the question: who are you going to be? Not in the big, watched moments. Not standing in front of a crowd with something to prove. In the small ones. In the dark ones. When someone is telling you, sincerely and with good reason, to run, and your body is telling you the same thing, and you have to decide whether that is who you are. Clara had already decided. She closed her eyes and let the pain settle into something she could carry. In the corner, Silas Thorne sat perfectly still with his hat over his face, and he did not sleep, not even close. He sat in the dark and listened to her breathing even out, and he kept watch over the window. And he tried very hard not to think about the way she had looked at him when she said it was not the end of the story. He didn't try hard enough. Clara woke before the sun was fully up. Her ribs had stiffened overnight into something that made getting off the bed a careful, slow production. She did it quietly. Silas was still in the chair, hat tilted forward, one hand resting near his holster, even in sleep. She looked at him for a moment. This strange, quiet man who had carried her out of a burning shame and then spent the night watching over a door. And she felt something she didn't quite have a name for yet. She let it go. She had work to do. Martha was already in the kitchen when Clara came downstairs, moving between the stove and the counter with the efficiency of someone who had been getting up before dawn her entire life. She set a cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits on the table without being asked. "Eat first," Martha said. Clara sat down and ate. The coffee was strong and real, and the biscuits were better than anything she'd had in weeks of hard road travel. She ate all of it, which surprised her. Pain usually takes her appetite, but she had learned young, and the hard way, that a person who doesn't eat doesn't think clearly. And she needed to think clearly today more than she ever had in her life. "The blacksmith," she said, when the plate was clean. "Elias, what can you tell me about him?" Martha turned from the stove. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and looked at Clara the way people look at you when they're deciding how much to say. "Elias Vance," she said. "He's been here longer than Kincaid has. Longer than most. He doesn't talk." She paused. "Can't talk." Kincaid's men saw to that about 5 years back, when Elias started asking too many questions about where certain families had gone. Clara set her cup down. "He knows something," she said. It wasn't a question. "Elias knows a great many things," Martha said. "But knowing and being able to share it are different problems." She looked at Clara steadily. "What are you planning?" "I was a school teacher," Clara said, "before I was a wife. And before that, I spent a summer in Philadelphia learning from a woman who had gone deaf and developed her own system for communicating with her students." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. More like the look of someone watching a piece of a puzzle click into place they hadn't known was missing. "The smithy opens at first light," she said. "He's always there before anyone else." Clara was out the door 10 minutes later. The street was quiet at that hour, gray and cool. A dog slept in a doorway. A rooster was arguing with the morning somewhere behind the general store. Clara walked with her hand pressed against her ribs and her eyes moving, taking in the shape of the town, the way certain buildings were well maintained and others had been left to fall, the way the sheriff's office sat at the center of the main street, like a fist holding everything else in place. The water well on the east end, padlocked shut with a heavy iron chain. She filed all of it away. The smithy was at the south end of town, set apart from the other buildings because of the heat it put out and the noise it made at working hours. This early, the forge was cold and dark, but the doors were open, and a man was inside moving between workbenches with the focused. Contained energy of someone who had long since made peace with silence. Elias Vance was a large man, broad in the chest and long in the arm, with hands that made even Silas's look ordinary. His face was weathered and dark from years over the forge, and his eyes were black and very bright. He turned when he heard her footsteps and went still. He looked at her bruising, at her posture. He didn't ask what happened. He just waited. "Mr. Vance," she said, "my name is Clara Dalton. My husband was Henry Dalton. He owned the eastern parcel, the one that borders the creek." She watched his face. Something shifted there. "I believe you may have known him." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once slow and careful. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know you can't speak. I know that what happened to you was a cruelty and a crime, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I learned something a while back from a woman in Philadelphia, and I think we can find a way to understand each other, if you're willing." He studied her, those bright black eyes moving over her face, the way a man reads a document he needs to be sure of, looking for dishonesty, looking for the angle, finding neither, apparently, because after a moment, he stepped back and gestured toward the inside of the smithy. She went in. They worked out the language together. The two of them, in the quiet of the early morning. It was a simple system at first. A nod for yes, a slow side to side for no, a touch to the chest for I, a point outward for you, or they or he. Clara built on it quickly, pulling from what she remembered and improvising where her memory came up short. She was a natural teacher, which means she was a natural student too. She watched Elias's hands carefully and mirrored him when he invented signs of his own. And they moved back and forth like that, slow at first, and then with more and more ease, the way two people figure out any language together. An hour in, they could hold something close to a real conversation. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps and repetitions and moments of frustration on both sides when meaning slipped through. But it worked. It was real. And when Clara finally managed to convey what she had come here to ask about, when she put together enough of their new shared language to ask whether Elias had ever seen a record, a list, a document kept by Kincaid about the land he had taken, something changed in the man's face. He went very still. Then he walked to the back of the smithy, to the farthest workbench, the one against the stone wall, stacked with tools and scrap iron and the ordinary clutter of a working shop. He moved three things: a heavy horseshoe collar, a bucket, a piece of old canvas. Beneath them was a loose stone in the base of the wall. He worked it free and reached into the space behind it with both hands. What he brought out was a book, slim and battered, the leather cover warped from age and damp, the edges of the pages dark with old handling. He held it for a moment. His hands around it were not gentle the way you hold something ordinary. They were gentle, the way you hold something that has cost you everything. He looked at Clara. She held out her hands. He placed the book in them. She opened it slowly. Her first thought was that it was a ledger, financial records, property records, the boring, careful accounting of land and money. But she kept reading, and within the first 3 pages, her hands started to shake. It was not a financial record. It was a list. Names. Parcels of land. The Keaton family. 200 acres. Northwest quarter. July 1000. 871. Gone the Morrison family. 140 acres. Creek adjacent. November 1000. 872. Gone the Alvarez family. 360 acres. Prime grazing land. March 1000. 873. Gone page after page after page. Families' names. Notes in Kincaid's handwriting, cold and administrative, like he was recording crop yields. Some entries had amounts of money next to them. The sale price he'd collected after the land changed hands, after the original owners no longer had any use for it. She turned another page, Henry Dalton. 380 acres. Eastern parcel, February 1000. 876. She stopped. She pressed her lips together and held very still until the wave passed. Then she turned another page. She found it near the middle of the book, partly because the page was different from the others. Older, softer. The handwriting was slightly different too. The script of someone younger, less practiced in the cold clinical documentation that came later. But the information was the same. Rosethorn, 90 acres, southern hillside, October 1866. She looked at Elias. He was watching her, those bright black eyes steady and careful. He nodded, slowly, confirming what her face was asking without her having to say it. This was not just a property record. This was a catalog of murders. Every entry in this book was a family that Hale Kincaid had destroyed to take what they had, killed or driven out or both, documented in his own hand, in his own ledger, with dates and amounts and all the neat, awful detail of a man who was proud of his work. And Rosethorn had been one of them, Silas's sister. Clara closed the book. She held it against her chest for a moment, with both arms. The way you hold something you intend to protect. She thought about Silas in the corner of that room last night, hat over his face, not sleeping. She thought about the way he moved, the way he held his jaw, the way he stood in every room like he was expecting the worst to find him and had made his peace with it a long time ago. She thought about a man who had been carrying the weight of a loss like this for 10 years. Alone in the dark, she looked at Elias. "You kept this safe," she said. He looked back at her. There was something in his face that had no word. The particular grief of a person who has held the truth alone for so long that it has become its own kind of prison, she said, slowly and carefully in their new language. "You are not alone anymore." His jaw moved. His eyes went bright and then brighter, and he looked at the ceiling for a moment. And when he looked back at her, he gave one slow, deliberate nod. She tucked the ledger inside her coat and buttoned it close. The truth had been silent in this town for 10 years. It had been buried under stone and fear, and the particular cruelty of a man who understood that the best way to keep people quiet is to make silence the only safe option. But truth doesn't die. That's the thing about it. It waits, it endures. It finds a teacher and a blacksmith in a cold smithy at first light, and it refuses, categorically and completely, to stay buried anymore. Clara walked out into the morning air. She had work to do. She should have gone straight back to the boarding house. She knew that in the clean, practical part of her brain that was always calculating the safest path. She had the ledger. She had what she came for, or at least a significant piece of it. She should have gone back, sat down with Silas, and worked out what to do next. Instead, she went to the courthouse. It was a squat, two-story building at the north end of the main street. The word Courthouse was carved above the door in letters that had once been gilded and were now just wood. She went inside, found the land records office on the ground floor, and spent 2 hours with a clerk who was very nervous and very unwilling, and eventually, under the sustained pressure of Clara's polite and immovable insistence, pulled every land transfer document filed in Dust Creek County going back 15 years. She sat at a long wooden table and cross-referenced them against the ledger. Every family in the ledger had a matching transfer document filed here, all legitimate on the surface, all properly stamped and witnessed and signed, which meant either the families had signed under duress or the signatures were forged. Given what she knew about Kincaid, she suspected both at different times and for different reasons. The important thing was this: property transferred fraudulently through coercion or forgery was not legally transferred at all. That was federal law. That was something she could use. She was still thinking about this when she left the courthouse. The alley caught her off guard. She had taken a shortcut between the courthouse and the main street. It was a narrow passage, shadowed even in mid-morning, lined with the backs of buildings. She was 3 steps in when she heard the footsteps behind her, and then 2 men materialized from a side door and stepped into her path. Kincaid's men. She recognized the badge, the dull silver star pinned crooked on a dusty lapel. She recognized the particular posture of men who have been given authority they did not earn and have mistaken permission for virtue. The taller one had a sneer built into his face, like it was a permanent feature. The shorter one was chewing tobacco and watching her with flat, disinterested eyes. "Well," the tall one said, "Mrs. Dalton, Sheriff's been wondering where you got to." Clara stopped walking. She looked at them both. She assessed the distance and the angles, and the fact that there was a wall behind her and more wall on both sides. Her hand moved toward the ledger inside her coat. Instinctively, protectively. The tall man saw it. "Hand it over," he said. "Whatever you got there." "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Sure you don't." He took a step toward her. "Let's make this easy. You hand it over. You walk away. Nobody gets hurt today. And if I don't..." The shorter one stopped chewing. The tall man tilted his head and smiled with one half of his mouth, the kind of smile that says, "The question has already been answered, and you just haven't heard it yet." Clara looked at the wall to her right, then the wall to her left, then back at the two men. She had just enough time to think, clearly and without panic, that this was a very bad situation, before the taller man's hand closed around her arm. Then something happened very fast. A shadow dropped from above. That was the only way she could think of it afterward. A shadow came down from the roofline. There was a sound of boots hitting the ground, and then the tall man made a short, sharp sound, and he was on the dirt. The shadow moved again, fluid and very fast, and the shorter man tried to reach for his gun and didn't get there. 2 seconds, maybe 3, 2 men on the ground, one holding his jaw and the other his wrist, and Silas Thorne standing between Clara and both of them, with his hands loose at his sides. His face was calm. That was the thing. Not angry. Not worked up. Calm the way a man is calm, when what he just did required no more consideration than stepping over a puddle. He looked at the 2 men on the ground. "Go tell Kincaid you fell," he said. The tall man stared at him. Then he got up slow and looked at his partner, and they left. No argument, no bravado, just the pragmatic wisdom of men who have encountered something they are not equipped to handle and know it. Silas turned to Clara. She noticed her hands were shaking. She had not noticed that until now. She pressed them flat against her legs. "You followed me," she said. "You should have gone back to Martha's. I had work to do, so did they," he said. He looked at the mouth of the alley where the 2 men had disappeared. "Kincaid knows you're still here. He's going to send more. And next time I might not be on the right rooftop." Clara took a breath, let it out. Let herself have one full moment of acknowledgement that had been close and frightening, and she did not want it to happen again. Then she straightened up. "Then we need to make sure it doesn't happen again," she said, "which is exactly what I want to talk to you about." He looked at her. That careful, complicated look. "Walk with me," she said. They came out of the alley into the back lane that ran parallel to the main street. The morning had warmed up, and the air smelled of horses and dust, and something baking in one of the houses further along. They walked side by side, not too close, keeping to the edges of things. Clara told him what she'd found. All of it. The cross-referencing at the courthouse, the land transfer documents, the fraudulent filings. She laid it out methodically, the way she had learned to present a lesson. Start with the foundation. Build carefully. Let the conclusion speak for itself. Then she took the ledger out from inside her coat. She held it out to him. He took it. He was quiet as he turned the pages. A long, careful quiet. She watched his face the way she had learned to watch students when they encountered something difficult, when something was costing them something to read. He stopped at a page near the middle. He was very still for a moment. His jaw did something, a small, barely visible tightening. Then he closed the book and held it in both hands and looked at the far end of the lane. "How long have you known?" he asked. His voice was even, contained, like a door that's been bolted shut from the inside. "About your sister." She said it gently. "Since this morning," he nodded slowly. He was somewhere else for a moment, somewhere she couldn't follow. Then he came back. "What are you proposing?" he said. "A partnership," she said. "I have the ledger. I have legal knowledge. I know how to build a case that will hold up in federal court. And I know that what's in that book is enough to put Kincaid away permanently if we can get it into the right hands." She looked at him directly. "But I need 2 things I don't have. I need someone who knows how this town works from the outside. The shadows, the back routes, the things Kincaid thinks are hidden. And I need to not get kicked to death in an alley before I can do any of that." Silas looked at her. "And what do you get out of it?" he said. Your land back. What about me? I get you your name back, she said. I have access to the same federal records that branded you an outlaw. If I can prove Kincaid fabricated the charges, and I believe I can, because men like him always fabricate them the same careless way, then we clear your record. You walk out of this, the other side, a free man. The lane was quiet around them, somewhere distant. A bell rang the hour. Silas looked down at the ledger in his hands. He turned it over once, that jaw tightening again. The one thing his careful face couldn't entirely suppress. In my experience, he said slowly, women who go looking for justice in towns like this one get buried in them. In my experience, Clara said, men who try to protect everyone alone don't do as good a job as they think. Something shifted in his face, almost a smile. Almost, it didn't quite get there. You're not what I expected, he said. Nobody ever is, she said. That's generally the point. He was quiet for another moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that means a man is making a real decision, not just a temporary one. Then he held out his hand. Clara looked at it. Then she shook it. His grip was firm and brief and completely serious. One condition, he said. Name it. You do what I say when I say it. When there's a gun in the equation, I don't need a conversation. I need you moving. He looked at her steadily. You think you can manage that? I think, she said, that I can manage most things. Which was the moment the patrol came around the corner. Two more of Kincaid's men, on horseback, moving slowly up the back lane. Silas saw them first. His hand closed around Clara's arm, and he moved, fast and smooth, pulling her back against the wall of the nearest building, into the deep shadow of a narrow overhang. Her back hit the wall. He was in front of her, one forearm against the boards above her head, the brim of his hat angled down, filling the space between them. The horses walked past 10 feet away. Neither rider looked their way. Clara could feel his breath. That was the thing she was most aware of, which was not the practical thing to be aware of given the circumstances. The warmth of it, the steadiness. His face was close enough that she could count the years in the lines around his eyes if she had wanted to, which she did not, because looking at him that closely was already doing something complicated to her concentration. She stayed very still. He stayed very still. The horses moved on. The sound of hooves faded. The patrol turned the corner at the far end of the lane and was gone. Silas didn't move immediately. He should have. They both knew that the danger had passed. The space between them had no practical use anymore, and yet he stayed there for one beat longer than necessary. Close enough that she could feel the tension in him, the particular quality of restraint that isn't the absence of something, but the deliberate holding of it. Then he stepped back, clean, immediate, like a curtain coming down. He straightened his hat and looked at the end of the lane where the patrol had gone. Starting tonight, he said, we don't move separately. You don't leave Martha's without telling me first. Agreed, she said. Her voice was admirably steady. All things considered. He nodded once, settled back into himself, back into the contained, careful stillness that seemed to be his natural condition. But as they walked back toward the boarding house, moving quiet through the back ways of Dust Creek, she noticed one thing. He kept himself between her and the street, the whole way, without comment or ceremony, without making a thing of it. Just a man who had decided something and had adjusted his position accordingly. Some partnerships are made with paperwork, some with handshakes, some with words in the light and promises in the dark, and some, the truest kind, are made with something quieter than all of that, with a person who simply moves to put themselves between you and the thing that's coming, and doesn't make a single word of it. They had a 2-hour head start. It wasn't enough. Kincaid's posse picked up their trail just outside the eastern edge of Dust Creek, somewhere between the old mill road and the creek crossing, where the ground was soft enough to hold boot prints. 7 men on fresh horses, armed, moving fast. Silas knew because he heard them. He had ears trained by a decade of survival. The kind of ears that register threat before the brain has even finished asking the question. He heard the distant percussion of hoofbeats and said one word. Run. Clara ran. They moved hard through scrub and pine and the thin, rocky terrain that climbed toward the mountains north of town. The cold was already something else up here. Not the manageable chill of the valley, but the sharp, purposeful cold of elevation. The kind that finds the gaps in your clothing and gets comfortable. The sky had gone the color of iron sometime in the last hour. The clouds were low and moving fast. Silas watched the sky while they moved, and his expression didn't improve. "Storm," he said. "How bad enough?" He knew these mountains, or had known them, years ago, when knowing them had been the difference between alive and otherwise. He angled them northwest, away from the obvious passes, away from the routes the posse would expect, through a stand of dense pine that closed over them like a ceiling, down a creek bank, and through the water itself, numbing cold around their ankles, destroying the scent trail. Up the other side, harder, rockier, the terrain getting more serious with every 100 feet of elevation. Clara kept up. He noticed that. She didn't complain, and she didn't slow him down. She watched where he put his feet and put hers in the same places. She was breathing hard but controlled, using her breath rather than fighting it. The first snow came sideways, not a gentle beginning, a flat, committed wall of it, driven by wind that had clearly been building itself up to this for some time. It hit them all at once like a door slamming. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees inside of 2 minutes, and the visibility went from poor to nearly nothing. The mine shaft appeared out of the white like a rumor. Just the dark mouth of it, set into the rock face, half hidden by an overhang of stone that had kept the entrance relatively clear. Old timbers framing the opening, gray with age but still solid. Silas didn't hesitate. He caught Clara's arm and pulled her in. The darkness inside was absolute at first. Then Silas produced matches from inside his coat and got one lit in cupped hands. It lasted long enough to find what he was looking for. A shelf of rock against the interior wall, with the remnants of old equipment left by whoever had worked this shaft, and then abandoned it. A tin lantern, nearly empty but not quite. A canvas tarp folded flat. A rusted bucket, the bones of someone's old camp. He got the lantern going, hung it on a nail in the timber. The light was thin and yellow, and it was everything. Outside, the blizzard hit the mountain, like it meant to take the whole thing apart. Clara sat on the canvas, with her back against the rock wall, and tried to regulate her breathing. Her wet boots were already conducting the cold, straight through her feet. Her coat was soaked through at the shoulders. She wrapped her arms around herself and worked on the immediate problem of shivering, which had started somewhere on the creek crossing and hadn't stopped since. Silas sat across from her. He'd taken off his duster coat, dry on the inside, still relatively warm. He held it out to her. She looked at it. "You'll freeze. I've been colder." She took it, put it around her shoulders. It was enormous on her, which was somehow both practical and quietly humbling. She pulled it tight and looked across the small space at him. He was in his shirt now, forearms on his knees. The lantern light caught the planes of his face, the hollows of it, the geography of a man who had lived very hard for a very long time. They could hear the wind, even inside the mountain, through solid rock and old timber. The storm made its presence known, a deep sustained moan that came and went in waves. "They won't follow in this," Silas said about the posse. "No," Clara agreed. "We're here till morning at least." "All right," he nodded, looked at the ground. She watched him. There is a particular quality to a person when the armor starts to come off. Not the dramatic kind, not the obvious kind, where something specific happens and the walls fall. The slow kind, the kind that comes from exhaustion and cold and darkness and hours of moving fast through difficult terrain, with a person you are starting to trust, whether you intended to or not. Silas was tired, really tired. Not just physically, though that too. The other kind. The weight in the chest kind that builds up in a person over years of carrying something they have never once set down. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. The storm did the talking. And in the spaces between gusts, Clara just sat with him in the quiet dark, which was its own kind of language. Then he said her name was Rose. Clara went very still. She was 17. He said I was 22. I'd been gone 6 months, working the cattle drives north to make enough to expand the holding. I sent money back when I could. He stopped, turned the brim of his hat in his hands. When I came back, the house was empty. Neighbors, said Kincaid, came with his men one night in October, said there was a dispute over the deed. He paused. There was no dispute. She was 17 and alone, and the deed was in her name because our father had died the spring before. The wind gusted and the lantern flame bent sideways. I found out what happened from a woman in the next county who had seen it, he said. Rose tried to fight them. She was like that, small and absolute. She didn't have a single ounce of quit in her. Something happened in his voice. A fracture so small and so quickly controlled that you would have missed it if you weren't watching carefully. They were gone before I could do anything. All of them. Rose and the property both. She's buried on a hill 3 miles east of here, in ground that belongs to Kincaid now. Clara didn't speak. I've been hunting him for 10 years, Silas said. 10 years of looking for the one piece of evidence I needed to take him down right. Legally, the way it would stick. He shook his head slowly. I couldn't find it. I came close twice. Both times the witnesses disappeared before I could get them to a federal marshal. He looked up. His eyes in the lantern light were very dark, and something was in them that had been behind the door for a long time. I failed her. Every way a person can fail someone. I did it. I wasn't there when it happened. I wasn't fast enough to stop it. I spent 10 years trying to fix it, and I couldn't do that either. He put his hands over his face. It was a quiet gesture, not dramatic. The gesture of a man who is very tired and has, finally, in the dark and the cold and the absence of anyone who expected him to be otherwise, allowed himself to stop holding everything together. His shoulders moved once, just once. Clara moved across the space between them and sat beside him. Not in front of him, not facing him, just beside him. She didn't say anything. She put one hand on his arm and left it there. He didn't pull away, she said. You were 22 years old. He didn't answer. You were 22, she repeated, quiet and clear. You were not supposed to save everyone. That is not a failure that belongs to you. She was my responsibility. She was your sister, Clara said. Not the same thing. And she was her own person. You said she was absolute. You said she had no quit in her. She felt him tense. A woman like that doesn't want to be saved. She wants to be believed. She wants someone to stand up and say what happened to her was wrong, and make sure the man who did it answers for it. A long pause. That's what we're doing, she said. Right now. That's what all of this is. He was quiet for a long time. The storm pressed against the mountain. The lantern burned. Then he lifted his head from his hands. His face was not the composed, armored face she had been looking at for 4 days. It was something rawer and truer and, somehow, younger the face, of the 22-year-old who had come home to an empty house and a hill with a grave on it and had been walking through that moment ever since. Your scars don't make you a monster, Silas, she said softly. She meant it completely. They prove you survived. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to before. Not the quick, assessing looks, the real one, unguarded and direct. She didn't look away. People talk about grief like it's a weakness, like surviving hard things and carrying the marks of them is something to be ashamed of. It isn't. The scars a person carries are not evidence of their failure. They are evidence of their endurance, of every moment they chose to keep going when going felt impossible. That is not weakness dressed up as something else. That is the truest definition of strength that exists. Silas leaned forward, slowly, like a question being asked very carefully. Clara didn't move back. The kiss was not the kind she might have expected from a man like him. It wasn't hard or brief or purely about need. It was careful, and then it was not careful. It was both things at once. The restraint and the desperate breaking of it, the tenderness and the grief and the long loneliness underneath it, all coming up to the surface at the same moment. She kissed him back when they broke apart. His forehead rested against hers, eyes closed, both of them breathing. The lantern between them small and steady. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, something that had been frozen for a very long time began, quietly to thaw. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. She stayed beside him, and he stayed beside her, and the storm kept going, and the mountain held them inside it. And sometimes that is everything a moment needs to be. Toward midnight, they slept. Not by plan, just from exhaustion claiming its due. Clara, with her back against the wall and his coat still around her shoulders. Silas with his back against the same wall, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. In the morning, the storm was over. The mountain was white and silent and achingly bright. They came down together. Not the same two people who had gone up. The smoke was visible from half a mile out, black and thick and rising fast. The kind of column that means something more than a chimney fire or a cook stove gone wrong. Silas saw it first. His stride changed, shortened, quickened. Clara looked up and saw it, and felt her stomach drop. Martha's boarding house. They ran. By the time they came around the corner of the main street, the building was fully engaged. The lower floor was a wall of orange light, the windows blown out from the heat. The curtains Martha had kept clean through 6 years of Dust Creek dust, now burning in the frames. The sign above the door was on fire. The dried flowers in the window boxes were ash. The street was full of people who were not doing anything. That was the part that struck Clara first, even before the heat hit her. A crowd of 15, 20 people, standing in a semicircle at what they had calculated to be a safe distance, watching the boarding house burn. Watching, hands at their sides, faces lit orange and red by the fire. The particular paralysis of people who have been afraid for so long that it has become their default response to everything. Kincaid's men were on horseback at the edge of the crowd, watching the crowd watch the fire, arms folded, satisfied. Martha was standing in the street, her apron in her hands, her face showing the particular devastation of a person watching everything they have built and maintained and fought for go up in smoke. She was not crying. She was past the kind of thing that ends in tears. She was in the place on the other side of it, where a person has been hit hard enough that they simply stand in the aftermath and exist. Silas reached her. "Is everyone out?" "I think so," Martha said. Her voice was dry and flat. "I think so, but there's a girl. There's a child on the second floor. She sleeps in the back room. I told her to come down. I didn't see her come." She didn't finish, because Clara was already moving. Silas put out his hand and caught nothing. She was already past him. He called her name. She didn't stop. Later, she would not be able to say with certainty what she was thinking in that moment, because the honest answer was that she wasn't thinking. She had heard the words child and second floor, and her body had simply decided. The front door was still intact, hot to the touch, but not yet burning through. She put her shoulder into it. The inside was worse than the outside suggested. The smoke was the immediate problem. Not just the smell of it, but the density of it. The way it replaced air was something that had no use for human lungs. She pulled the collar of her dress up over her nose. It helped a small amount. She moved low, the way she had heard was better, and went for the stairs. The stairs were there. The banister on the left was on fire. She used the wall. The heat on the second floor was a different creature than the heat downstairs. It had weight. It pressed against her, pushed against her face and hands. The kind of heat that is not metaphorical about what it wants. The smoke was thicker here, black and fast-moving, rolling along the ceiling in great dense waves. She could not see. She counted doors. Martha had said back room. The back room would be the one at the far end of the hall, away from the street, which meant toward the part of the building where the heat was currently worst. She moved. Her eyes were streaming. Her lungs were filing a formal protest. She kept one hand on the wall and moved forward by feel. Found the door at the end of the hall. Found the handle. Too hot to hold properly. She used her dress over her palm and pushed. The room inside was full of smoke, but not yet on fire. On the floor in the corner, curled against the baseboards, because the air was cleaner down there, was a girl of about 7 years. Dark hair, bare feet, a nightgown. A face that had been crying so hard it had run out and was now just terrified. Clara crossed the room and lifted her. The girl grabbed on with both arms around Clara's neck and held with the grip of a small person who is absolutely certain they are about to die and has found the one thing in the world they are not letting go of. "I've got you," Clara said, directly into her ear. "Clear. Certain. I have you. Hold on." She moved back toward the door. The hallway was worse now. The wall to the left had caught. The banister was entirely gone. The head of the stairs was a narrow, dangerous path between two walls of fire. Clara held the girl against her chest with both arms and pressed herself to the right side of the staircase, as far from the left wall as the structure allowed. She went down fast. The bottom stair gave way under her right foot. She caught herself on the wall. The girl made no sound, just tightened her grip. Clara found the floor, found the front door, put her shoulder into it again, and they came out. The cold outside air hit like water. Clara staggered 2 steps into the street and then stood. Her dress was scorched along the left side, a ragged brown burn climbing the hem. Her face was streaked black with soot. Her eyes were streaming from the smoke. Her arms were still wrapped around the girl, who was now making a sound. A thin, sustained sound that was not quite crying, more like the sound a person makes when they have been somewhere very close to the end of everything and have come back. The crowd was silent. Silas was there before anyone else, reaching for them both. Clara shook her head. She stood there and held the girl and let the crowd look at her. Let them look. There was something educational happening in that moment, though it was not a classroom lesson and there was no blackboard. It was the kind of lesson that bypasses the brain entirely and goes straight to the chest. The lesson of a woman with no weapon and no title and no official authority walking into a burning building because a child was inside, because someone had to, and coming out the other side. "Help me," Clara said. Not dramatic. She looked at the crowd directly. Someone take her. A woman near the front stepped forward and took the girl, and the child transferred her death grip from Clara's neck to this new person without losing a beat. Clara looked at the crowd. "This is your town," she said. Her voice was rough from the smoke, but it carried. "This building belongs to Martha, and Martha has lived in this town her entire life, and she has fed you and housed you and kept the lights on when everything else here went dark." She looked at Kincaid's men on their horses at the edge of the crowd, then back at the townspeople. "And the man who ordered this burning is sitting right there, looking at you, because he knows you're going to look at your shoes." Nobody moved. "There's a well at the east end of this street," Clara said. "It's locked. I know it's locked. But there are 24 of you, and you have hands." She looked at the burning building, at Martha standing in the street, at the girl being held by the woman from the crowd, still making that thin, frightened sound. "If you do nothing again today, that's your choice. But it will cost you something you won't be able to buy back." A long beat. Then a man in the middle of the crowd moved. He walked to the building across from the burning one and picked up a water bucket hanging on its exterior wall. He looked at the man next to him. That man went to the well, found that the padlock on the chain, while heavy, was not equal to the sustained attention of a large man with a rock and 2 minutes of determined effort. It gave. The chain dropped. The well opened, and then it was not one man and not two. It was a line forming, a bucket passing hand to hand. The particular momentum of people who have been waiting for permission and have just discovered they gave it to themselves. A woman from the general store brought her own buckets. A teenage boy who hadn't spoken ran for the trough at the livery. Martha stood in the street and watched her town. Her actual town, the people she had served and protected and kept dinner warm for, finally choose a side. She pressed her hand over her mouth. On the edge of the crowd, Kincaid's men exchanged a look. Silas was standing right there, and he watched their faces, and he saw the exact moment when they did the arithmetic. 2 of them against a town that had just remembered it was a town. He put his hands in his pockets and watched them ride away, and did not feel the need to look especially satisfied about it, though he was. He went to Clara. She was sitting on the steps of the building, across the street, elbows on her knees, hands loose, staring at nothing. Her hair had come entirely undone. The soot on her face made her look like she'd come back from somewhere much farther away than a second floor. He sat beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't either, for a while. They watched the bucket brigade work, watched the fire begin, slowly, and then with more conviction, to lose the argument. "You could have been killed," he said finally. Yes, she said. She didn't pretend otherwise. I told you I know what you told me. She looked at him, her eyes, red from smoke and dry from heat, were still entirely clear. There was a child in there. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said, that was all. He knew. Some things don't need more discussion than that. The bucket brigade worked for 2 hours. They lost the first floor entirely. The second floor held. The structure held. It was Martha's building. After all, she had built it to last. By mid-afternoon, the fire was out. Dust Creek stood in the street and looked at itself. Something had shifted. You could see it in the way people were standing, in the conversations happening, in the way the fear that had been each person's private possession all morning was starting to become something shared, something communal. Fear you carry alone crushes you. Fear you carry together becomes something you can set down. Martha walked through the crowd with her flour-dusted apron still on and thanked every person she passed by name. She had known their names all along. The plan was Clara's, every piece of it. She laid it out at Martha's kitchen table the following night, on a piece of paper she'd drawn from memory in the boarding house's back room, which now served as their operations center, since the front half of the building was charred and open to the sky. She had sketched Kincaid's office from the land records visits, the courthouse trips, the 2 occasions she had been inside it herself, the front entrance, the back staircase, the second floor layout, the approximate position of the heavy iron safe she had seen once through a partially open door. Silas studied the drawing for a long time. The safe is behind the desk, he said. You've been in that office once. 7 years ago, he touched the paper. It was a Holloway combination lock, 4-dial. They weren't common even then. Can you open it? He looked at her with an expression that said the question didn't entirely deserve an answer. Right, she said. The safe. You go through the roof. Supply room above has a loading hatch in the ceiling. I can get onto the roof from the livery next door. He traced the route with one finger. 2 guards on the second floor, one at the bottom of the stairs. Kincaid usually works late. Not tonight, Clara said. Tonight Kincaid won't be in his office. She let that sit there. You're going to talk to him, Silas said. It was not a question. I'm going to engage him, she said, which was a careful way of putting it, loudly in the front room, in front of every deputy, customer, and bystander in that saloon. A formal legal challenge to his land claims, citing federal property statutes. She looked at Silas across the table. He won't be able to walk away from it. Men like Kincaid need the crowd. They need everyone to see them win. I'm going to give him the chance to do that, while I'm upstairs. While you're upstairs. He was quiet. She knew what he was running in his head, the ways it could go wrong, the guards, the timing, the weight of the safe door. The question of whether the ledger was even still there, or had been moved after the alley encounter. There's something else, she said. She held his eyes. I want you to know what you're walking into. If I hold Kincaid's attention long enough, you'll have approximately 20 to 30 minutes in that office. If I can't hold him that long, things get complicated, she paused. And if something goes wrong on your side and the guards sound an alarm, then you walk out the front door, he said immediately, without waiting for me. You take the ledger copy and you walk. Silas Clara, he said her name the way he did sometimes, with a weight and a precision that made it mean more than the word itself. That is not negotiable. She studied him. He looked back at her with the face that admitted no argument. Fine, she said. She looked down at the paper. There's one more thing, she said. I need something to wear. He blinked. What? He needs to see me coming, she said. He needs to not see you, which means I need to be impossible to look away from. She folded the paper. I need Martha. Martha, it turned out, had a trunk under the bed in her own room, the one room that the fire had left entirely untouched. Inside the trunk, wrapped in brown paper and smelling of cedar, was a dress she had bought in St. Louis in 1869 and never worn, because there had never been an occasion in Dust Creek worthy of it. It was red, not a pale or apologetic red. A deep, unapologetic occupies the room red, the kind of color that does what it came to do and makes no excuses. Clara put it on. Martha adjusted the back, quickly, and with the efficiency of a woman who knows her way around a garment. She stepped back, looked at Clara the way a person looks at a piece of work they're not entirely sure they expected to come out this well. Lord have mercy, Martha said quietly. That's the idea, Clara said. Silas was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up when she came down. Something moved across his face that he did not manage to control before it was visible. And then he controlled it, and he looked at the middle distance instead, adjusted his hat, cleared his throat. Ready, he said, entirely, she said. They split at the corner of the main street. No ceremony, he went left, toward the livery. She went straight. She pushed open the saloon doors at 9 o'clock exactly. The room hit her in a wave, tobacco and lamp oil, and the accumulated noise of a dozen conversations. The bar ran the full length of the left wall. Tables filled the middle. Kincaid was exactly where she expected him. At the large round table, at the far end of the room. Card spread. 2 deputies flanking him. His boots up on an empty chair. He saw her the moment she came in. Everyone did. She walked to the center of the room and stopped. She stood there for a moment and let the room settle, and the conversations die, and the attention come to her the way water runs downhill. Because some things happen naturally when you make them easy enough. Sheriff Kincaid, she said. Her voice filled the room without effort. I have a matter of federal law I'd like to discuss with you. Kincaid looked at her over his cards. He took his time, the slow, deliberate assessment of a man who believes he controls the temperature of every room he's in. Mrs. Dalton, he said, you've got nerve. I'll give you that. Thank you, she said pleasantly. Shall we discuss the Homestead Act of 1862, specifically the sections pertaining to fraudulent land transfer and the federal penalties attached to it? She pulled a chair from the nearest table, sat down, crossed her hands on the tabletop, and looked at him with the patient, organized attention of a schoolteacher who has all day and is not going anywhere. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't leave. She had read him right. He was in his room, in front of his men, and a woman was challenging him in public. He could not walk away from that. His authority didn't survive being walked away from. He folded his cards and gave her his attention. She began to talk. Meanwhile, Silas came off the roof of the livery and landed on Kincaid's roof without a sound. He had a particular relationship with rooftops, not sentimental, just practical. A roof gave you height and shadow, and the particular advantage of being in a place people's eyes don't naturally travel. He moved across the shingles in a crouch, slow and even, distributing his weight carefully to keep the noise below the wind. The loading hatch was where he remembered. He opened it 1 inch and listened. Nothing from below. He opened it the rest of the way. The supply room was dark and smelled paper and dust. He dropped in and let his eyes adjust. Filing cabinets, a broken chair, a stack of boxes. The door to the hallway was closed. He pressed his ear to it. The guard in the hallway was close. He could hear breathing the shift of boots. The man was alert. No good waiting for that to change. Silas opened the door smoothly and moved. And 30 seconds later, the guard was propped against the wall in the supply room, alive and breathing and going to have a significant headache in the morning. And Silas had his key ring. The second guard at the top of the stairs required a different approach. Silas went back to the supply room window, out onto the exterior ledge, 12 feet above the alley, and moved along the building, faced to the window of the adjacent room. Came in from the other direction. The second guard didn't hear anything until the very last moment, which was not soon enough. He joined the first one in the supply room. Silas locked the door. Kincaid's office was at the end of the hall. The desk was where he remembered. The safe was behind it, set into the wall behind a painting of a landscape that Kincaid likely believed added an air of culture to the room. Silas took the painting down, set it face against the wall. The Holloway 4-dial lock stared back at him. Dull brass, worn smooth from use. The combinations scratched lightly into the mechanism housing in the kind of shorthand a person uses when they're afraid of forgetting. Silas read it, turned the dials, and heard the tumblers fall. He opened the safe. The ledger was there. He picked it up, and his hands held it in the same careful, heavy way that people hold things that have cost them everything. He thought about Rose for one moment. One clear, brief moment of acknowledgement. Then he tucked the ledger under his arm and went back to the safe. What he found next stopped him cold. A telegram. Recent, the paper still bright, the ink still dark, from a sender identified only as RH. But the content was Kincaid's, relayed back to him. Confirmation of an agreement. He read it. He read it again. It was not about the land. It was not about Clara or the ledger or anything that had happened in the last week. It was larger than that, much larger. Kincaid had sold the entire town, every building, every lot, every acre of farmland on the western side of the valley, sold to a railroad developer named Harlan Roth for a sum that had enough zeros to make Silas stop and count them twice. The transfer was complete, legal in the corrupt, Kincaid manufactured way that all of his transfers were legal. The deed was already signed. The telegram said something else too. Roth's representative would arrive on the morning train, and Kincaid, to facilitate the transfer of a town that still had people living in it, was expected to ensure that any remaining residents who might contest the claim would be removed before that meeting. The word removed had no ambiguity in it. Dawn, tomorrow, the remaining holdouts, all of them. Silas looked at the telegram for one more second. Then he folded it carefully into the ledger, tucked the whole thing back under his arm, and moved. He took the stairs instead of the roof. The bottom floor guard heard him coming and had his gun halfway out when Silas hit the door at the foot of the stairs. He went through it fast, and the guard went down, and Silas came out through the back of the building into the alley. He pressed against the wall and looked at the slice of Main Street visible from the alley's mouth. Clara was still at the table. She had Kincaid's cards spread in front of her now, which had not been part of any plan, and she was explaining something with patient, detailed energy, pointing to specific hands, and apparently demonstrating some point about probability or law or both. And Kincaid was sitting across from her, with the expression of a man who walked into what he thought was a simple game and has discovered the other person is playing an entirely different one. 3 deputies were watching from the bar, not intervening, not because they approved of the conversation, but because they were also watching Kincaid for the signal. And the signal hadn't come, because Kincaid was too invested in winning the table to admit he'd lost it. Silas caught her eye across the room. She didn't react. Nothing in her face changed. She kept talking to Kincaid, steady and organized, citing something that sounded like it had footnotes. But her right hand, resting on the table, moved once, a small deliberate signal. Got it. He moved back into the alley. He made his way around to the side street and waited in the shadows beside the saloon. She came out 7 minutes later. She walked out the front door at a measured, unhurried pace, down the boardwalk steps, turned the corner. The moment she was out of the saloon's line of sight, she moved fast. She came around the building and found him in the shadows, and they looked at each other. You have it, she said. I have it, he said. And something else. He showed her the telegram. She read it. The card player's calm on her face stayed intact, but just barely. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes moved fast over the words, and when she looked up, her face had the particular quality of someone who has just had a time limit placed on something that didn't have one before. Dawn, she said. Dawn, he said. They looked at each other in the dark of the alley. The night had a lot of hours in it still, but not enough, not nearly enough. We need the marshals, Clara said. She had already sent one telegram, days ago. A careful and precise communication to the federal marshal's office in Albuquerque, laying out the charges and requesting intervention. She had received no confirmation, no reply. We need them here by morning, Silas said, or we need another plan. The stars overhead were very bright and very cold. The wind had picked up again. Down at the end of the main street, the saloon light spilled warm and yellow across the dirt, and inside it, Hale Kincaid was dealing cards to men who did not know that tomorrow morning he intended to kill them all. Clara held the ledger against her chest. We go back to Martha's, she said. We tell everyone. Tonight, she looked at him. Every person in this town who is going to fight, she said, needs to know what they're fighting by morning. He nodded. She smoothed the front of the red dress with both hands, lifted her chin, They walked out of the shadows together. They told the town at midnight. Martha's back room held 11 people if nobody moved their elbows, and nobody did. Elias was there. The man who had started the bucket brigade was there. A farmer named Cole, with hands like tree roots and a face that had stopped lying about anything years ago. The woman who had taken the girl from Clara's arms outside the burning building. 3 others from the bucket line. Martha herself, standing by the door with her arms folded. Silas read the telegram aloud. He didn't editorialize. He didn't add to it. He just read what it said and let the words do the work. Because some information doesn't need help landing. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Cole spoke first. "Dawn," he said. Not a question, just the word. Turned over in his mouth like something he was checking the weight of. "Dawn," Silas confirmed. "How many men does he have?" 12 deputies, I can confirm. Possibly more he's brought in quietly this week. Elias signed something. Clara watched his hands and translated. "He's asking about the water well," she said. "He's saying that if they lock it again, we lose the fire line. He won't bother locking it," Martha said from the door. "He's not planning to leave anything to burn." The room went quiet again, in a different way than before. The quietness of people who have just had the full shape of a thing explained to them and are sitting with it. This is the moment that defines a community. Not the town meeting where everyone agrees and the stakes are low. Not the celebration when things go right. The moment in the dark, past midnight, when someone lays out exactly how bad it is, and every person in that room has to decide, privately and without announcement, who they intend to be about it. One by one they decided. Cole nodded. The woman with the girl nodded. The others shifted, settled, committed themselves in the small visible ways that mean the large invisible thing has been resolved. "The ledger," Clara said. "I'm going to need to get a copy to the federal marshal's office before dawn. I sent a telegram 6 days ago. If they received it, and if they moved on it." "There's a chance the station master," Martha said. "Gerald. He's not Kincaid's man. He's just a frightened man, which is different." "Can you get to him tonight?" "I can get to anyone in this town at midnight," Martha said. "I've been feeding them since 1870. She was out the door before anyone else spoke. They planned until 2 in the morning. Positions. Signals who stood where and held what, and when they moved. Clara and Silas laid it out together, trading pieces back and forth across Martha's kitchen table, with the ease of people who have learned each other's thinking well enough to finish each other's sentences, which they had, whether they'd meant to or not. At 2:15, they sent the townspeople home to prepare. At 2:30, Silas said they needed to move the ledger out of Martha's. If Kincaid sent men to search the building before dawn, which he might, they couldn't afford to lose it. "I'll take it to Elias," Clara said, back behind the loose stone. "I'll go with you." "You'll slow me down," she said, not unkindly. The shoulder he'd wrenched, coming down from Kincaid's roof, was clearly bothering him more than he was saying. She could tell by the way he held his left arm slightly closer to his body than his right. "I'll be there and back in 20 minutes. He looked at her. 15, she corrected. He let her go. She could see it cost him something. She was 12 minutes out and 6 minutes back, and she came around the corner of the back lane behind Martha's boarding house in the dark, moving quiet and fast with the empty coat held close. And the man came out of the shadows of the adjacent doorway without any warning at all. Not a deputy. Worse, one of the privately hired guns Kincaid had imported for exactly this kind of work. Bigger than the deputies. Quieter, the gun was already out. Silas came from the other direction. She didn't see exactly what happened because it was dark and it was fast, and she was already moving. But she heard the shot. One shot, clean and sharp in the cold night air. And then silence. She turned. Silas was standing. The hired gun was not. But Silas was standing wrong. He had one hand against the wall of the building behind him, and he was breathing with the specific controlled attention of someone managing something serious. She was beside him in 3 steps. The bullet had taken him high in the left shoulder. Entry wound clean, which meant it was still in there. His shirt was already dark and wet, spreading faster than she wanted to look at directly. Can you walk, she said. Yes, said with more certainty than his face supported. Then walk, she said, and she put her arm around him and they walked. They made the tree line east of town in 14 minutes. She didn't stop. She kept them moving another quarter-mile into the dark pines, far enough that the town was invisible behind them, until she found what she was looking for. A clear space, a fallen log, a shallow depression in the rock that would hold a small fire below the sight line. She got the fire going. She had been keeping a small kit in her coat pocket for 3 days. The kind of preparation that comes from traveling with a man who does dangerous things and planning accordingly. A small blade, clean cloth, the dark glass bottle from Martha's medical shelf, which she had borrowed without asking and intended to return when this was over. A threaded needle, wrapped in the cloth. She made Silas sit on the fallen log. She cut the shirt away from the wound. It was bad, not unsurvivable bad, but serious and getting more serious with the rate of bleeding. The bullet was in deep. She could feel, very carefully, with 2 fingers. How deep? She would need both hands and a steady nerve, and the absolute cooperation of the man losing blood in front of her. This is going to be bad, she said. I know, he said. Don't move. She worked by firelight. This is not a skill that comes easily or quickly, and she did not have it easily or quickly. What she had was the knowledge she'd picked up in necessity. In 3 years of ranch life, where the nearest doctor was 40 miles of bad road away, and the knowledge that the only thing worse than doing this was not doing it. Silas made no sound. That was the thing. She worked and he sat absolutely still and silent, and only his breathing told her what it was costing him. Long and controlled and very careful. The breathing of a man keeping himself together through sheer discipline because he had decided to, and that was the only reason. She got the bullet out. She cleaned the wound, bound it tight with the clean cloth, as tight as the shoulder would tolerate. She did it methodically and quickly, and when she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. His face was gray. His eyes were open but not entirely focused. The blood loss was working on him. She could see it in the color of his skin, in the way his hands lay on his knees with a looseness that didn't belong to him. Clara, he said, I'm here. Listen to me. His voice was slow. The particular slowness of words being assembled carefully when the machinery doing the assembling is running low on fuel. The ledger is in the smithy. You know where. At dawn, you take it and you go to the center of the street. You don't wait for me, Silas. You have the plan. You have the people. You don't need me standing there to make it work. He stopped, breathed. You never needed me for that part. You just needed me to keep the wolves off long enough for you to do it. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. You take the ledger and you do what you came here to do. Don't wait, I heard you, she said. Promise me. She put both hands on the sides of his face. He went very still, his eyes focused, coming back to her out of the gray distance they'd been drifting toward. Listen, the voice was not gentle and it was not soft. It was firm and clear and direct. The voice of a woman who has decided something and is making sure the other person understands the decision is final. You do not get to tell me to leave you out here. Not after everything. Not after the mine shaft and the burning building in the alley and every other thing. You don't get to do that. He opened his mouth. She kissed him. It was not the kiss in the mine shaft. That had been careful and then desperate and layered, with the particular grief of 2 people finding each other in the dark. This was different. This was fierce. This tasted like tears she hadn't known. She was crying and the iron tang of his blood still on her hands, and the specific fury of a woman who has been told one too many times by this man that she should go ahead without him. She pulled back enough to look at him. His eyes were fully focused now. She had his complete attention, which was what she had intended. We walk out of this hell together, she said, or we don't walk out at all. Those are the terms. Are we clear? He stared at her. Are we clear? Silas. Something happened in his face. The complicated, layered thing that moved through him when he was genuinely reached. When something actually got past all of the armor and landed where it was aimed. His jaw moved. His eyes went bright in the firelight. Clear, he said quietly. She sat beside him. She kept her hand on his arm through the remaining hours of the night. She felt, when his breathing evened out, into something approaching sleep. She kept the fire low and her eyes on the tree line, and she sat with the cold and the dark and the weight of the morning ahead. She had been afraid before. Of course she had. Fear is not the enemy. Fear is information. It tells you the stakes are real and the thing you're doing matters, and you had better pay attention. What you do with the fear is the question. She had answered it for herself a long time ago. You feel it, you acknowledge it, and then you get up and you do the thing anyway, because the alternative is a life lived in the safe corners. And she had seen what that looked like. She had watched a room full of men choose the safe corner and look at their shoes. She was not that. She never had been. The night moved past them slowly, the stars tracking west overhead, and when the first gray light began to seep into the darkness between the pines, Clara stood up. She looked at Silas. His color was better. Not good, but better. Morning, she said. He opened his eyes immediately. He had not been sleeping, she realized. He had been doing the same thing she had, holding on, getting to the morning. He looked at her, and then he looked at the gray light in the trees, and then he stood up, slow, one-handed, but he stood. Let's go, he said. The main street of Dust Creek was empty at dawn. That was the first thing Kincaid saw when he rode in. He rode at the front, always the front. 12 men behind him on horses, armed and fed and paid in advance, the way professionals liked to be paid. He had expected resistance. He had planned for resistance. He had not expected this particular kind of resistance. A woman standing alone in the center of the dirt road. She was wearing a dress that had seen better days. Her hair was up but barely. She had the look of someone who had not slept and was not pretending otherwise. In her hands, held up at chest height so everyone could see it, was a leather ledger. He stops horses 20 yards out. He looked at her, at the ledger, at the empty buildings behind her, at the absence of the crowd he had expected. Then he looked again, more carefully, at the empty spaces in the doorways, the shadows that weren't quite empty, the shapes that resolved as his eyes adjusted into people. Elias in the doorway of the smithy with his arms crossed. Cole and the bucket brigade men along the front of the general store. Martha in her doorway with a shotgun that was probably older than half of Kincaid's hired men. The woman who had held the girl, standing at the corner of the boarding house with 3 others, all of them with something in their hands. Pitchforks, old rifles. One man holding the handle of a long-handled axe with the focused grip of someone who has spent years knowing how to use it. Not soldiers, not lawmen, farmers and shopkeepers, and a boarding house owner in a flour-dusted apron. Everything they were carrying was, primarily and mostly, a working tool. But they were not standing like people who intended to use those tools for work. Kincaid looked at Clara. Clara looked at Kincaid. The ledger you're looking at, she said, clear and carrying. The voice of a woman who had spent years making sure that 30 children in the back of a room could hear every word, is a complete record of every murder and fraudulent land seizure you have committed in this county since 1866. It contains your handwriting, your dates, your amounts. She didn't pause. It has already been reviewed by a federal land attorney, and a copy is currently in the hands of the United States Marshal's Office in Albuquerque. Kincaid's jaw tightened. I also have this. She held up the telegram with her other hand, which is your written agreement with Harlan Roth to sell this town, and the notation that you intended to remove the holdouts this morning. She looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has tried to cheat and has not tried very hard. Remove is an interesting word, notably different from, say, negotiate with or compensate. A federal prosecutor is going to find that very interesting. Kincaid looked at his men, then back at her. He had a calculation to make, a room full of calculations, actually the ledger, the telegram, the crowd in the doorways, the fact that his information said the marshal's office had not responded to any inquiry from this town. Mrs. Dalton, he said, with a smile that had no warmth in it anywhere. You are bluffing, I am not, she said. You are? he said, and you've been a remarkable inconvenience. But it ends this morning. He looked at his men and gave the signal. The two lead riders raised their rifles. From the saloon rooftop, Silas fired. The first rider's rifle spun out of his hands. The second rider's hat came off. Not an accident, not a miss. A very precise demonstration of where the shots had been placed, and why, and the implication of where they could be placed if the targets shifted from accessories to principals. Kincaid's men looked at the rooftop, a man up there, one shoulder wrapped in dark cloth, prone on the shingles with a rifle that he handled like a man who had been doing this since before most of them were shaving. Kincaid drew his revolver. "Take him," he said. Three of his men swung their rifles toward the rooftop. Silas dropped two of them in the shoulder before the third found his angle. The third shot hit the shingles 2 feet from Silas's head. Silas moved, rolled, came up in a different position. He fired twice more. The third man's rifle went into the dirt. He fired 4 more times, working the line of riders with the methodical attention of a man who knows exactly how many rounds he has and is not wasting a single one. His rifle clicked empty. The rooftop was silent. Kincaid heard it. His men heard it. The particular sound of a gun that has said everything it has to say. Kincaid turned back to Clara and raised his revolver. She didn't move. She stood in the road and held the ledger and looked at him. And she did not move, because running was exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted was the one thing she had decided. A long time ago, in a much less dramatic set of circumstances. She was not in the habit of giving men like him. From the rooftop, Silas dropped the rifle. He stood up, one good arm, one shoulder bound tight and running out of what it had left. He looked at the distance from the rooftop to the ground, made the calculation, made it the way he made all calculations now, which is to say he factored in the woman in the road and found that it simplified the math considerably. He jumped. He hit the boardwalk hard and rolled and came up running, past the saloon front, past two of Kincaid's dismounted men who were too slow to stop him, down the boardwalk, off the end, into the dirt of the main street, running hard toward Clara with his bad arm tucked and his face set in the expression of a man who has decided to be somewhere and will not be stopped getting there. Kincaid tracked with the revolver and aimed. Not at Silas, at Clara, right between her eyes. She saw it. She felt the geometry of it. The line of the barrel and the eye behind it, and the very particular kind of stillness that falls over a moment right before something irreversible happens. Kincaid's finger tightened on the trigger. The train whistle split the morning open like an axe. Not a distant sound, not a far-off suggestion of a sound. It came from the south end of town, from the direction of the station. A blast that was physical as much as audible. Something you felt in your sternum and your back teeth. It did not end. It kept going. Long and full and absolutely certain. The announcement of something very large, arriving with complete intention. Every horse on the main street lost its mind simultaneously. Kincaid's mount shied hard to the left. His shot went wide, into the dirt 6 feet from Clara's shoes. He grabbed for the reins. Around him, his men's horses were spinning and rearing, and in 2 cases depositing their riders directly into the dust without apology. The train rolled into Dust Creek Station at reduced speed, but no ceremony. It was not a passenger train. It was long and dark, and the cars were armored. The kind of reinforcement you don't add to something, unless you're expecting to arrive somewhere that isn't entirely welcoming. It stopped with a long iron scream of brakes, and then the doors opened. Car after car, and men came out. United States Marshals, in full federal authority. Badges catching the morning light. Armed with the kind of weapons that belong to a government that has decided it is done being ignored. 12 of them, then 15, then 20. Spreading out from the station onto the main street with the organized efficiency of people who had been briefed and were ready. The lead marshal was a tall man in a gray coat who walked like a man who has never been in a hurry because he has never needed to be. He came up the main street and took one look at the assembled scene and turned to the man beside him and said something brief. Then he looked at Kincaid. Kincaid looked at the marshals. He looked at his men, half of whom were still trying to control their horses, and 2 of whom were picking themselves up from the dirt, and the remainder of whom were doing the same arithmetic he was. He looked at Clara. She was still standing in the road, holding the ledger, hair undone and dress scorched at the hem and face showing every one of the hours of the night she had been up. She looked like someone who had been through everything this town had to offer and was still there. He looked at his revolver. His hand opened. The gun hit the dirt. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not the gesture of a man making a noble decision. It was the gesture of a man who has run the numbers and found them irrefutably against him, and who is underneath all the cruelty and the posturing, ultimately a coward. The same thing he had always been. It had just taken the right combination of a woman with a ledger and a man on a rooftop and a federal train to make it visible. His men dropped their guns, one by one, the sound of it moving down the line. Silas reached Clara. He stopped beside her, breathing hard, one arm, and looked at Kincaid in the dirt in front of them. He looked at the marshals moving up the street. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. There were 1,000 things in that look. The mine shaft and the camp fire and the bullet and the kiss and the long cold night and every word they had said to each other in the dark. All of it compressed into a single held moment. Then Silas looked at the lead marshal and nodded toward Kincaid. "He's all yours," he said. The sound that followed was not a shot and not a shout. It was a hammer. Elias came out of the smithy doorway with his massive blacksmith's hammer held in both hands, and he crossed the street with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment for 5 years. He walked past the horses and past the deputies being taken into custody and past Kincaid himself without looking at any of them. He went to the water well at the east end of the street. He raised the hammer. He brought it down on the iron chain. The chain was thick and heavy and had held this town's water locked away for 5 years. It had been a symbol as much as a physical object, the symbol of a man's belief that he could own not just the land, but the basic necessities of life, that he could lock away the things people needed to survive and dispense them on his own terms. The hammer came down a second time. The chain split. The lock fell into the dirt. The well was open. The morning light was fully up now, and Dust Creek Main Street was full of federal marshals and dropped guns and horses, finding their manners and townspeople coming out of doorways. And in the middle of all of it, Elias stood at the open well with his hammer at his side and his face tilted up toward the sky. He couldn't speak. That had been taken from him, but his face said everything. The particular expression of a man who has held a truth in silence for a very long time and has watched it. Finally, come into the light. Clara stood beside Silas. She was shaking, not from fear, the shaking that comes after. The body catching up with everything it has been asked to do, and do without complaint for too long, presenting its bill all at once. Silas put his one good arm around her. She leaned into him, just slightly, just enough. "We walked out," she said. "We did," he said, "down the street." The lead marshal had Kincaid in irons. Kincaid was talking. The fast and calculating talk of a man who believes there is still a deal to be made, that there is always a deal to be made, that the world is full of people who can be bought, and this man in the gray coat must be one of them. The marshal in the gray coat was not listening. He was reading the ledger. 3 months later, Dust Creek had a new name. It said so on a fresh-painted sign at the junction of the 2 roads that came into town from the south and west. Someone had made it from good pine and taken their time with the letters. Hope's End, it said, which struck some visitors as an odd choice, until someone explained that it meant the place where hoping stopped being necessary, where you had arrived. The town had changed in other ways, too. The cooperative farm that Cole had been quietly suggesting for 2 years. The idea nobody had time for, while Kincaid's boot was on their neck, was now producing more than any individual homestead on the valley had managed in a decade. The shared water from the open well ran through a new irrigation line that Elias had designed and built over 6 weeks in September. The boarding house had a new front half, built better than the original, by the hands of people who came to do it, because they wanted to, and stayed because Martha fed them. The sheriff's office was different, too. The dull silver star now belonged to Cole, who wore it straight on his lapel and had not, in 3 months of wearing it, made a single decision that required a man to be afraid of him. The federal case against Hale Kincaid had moved with the particular speed of something that is both airtight and in the hands of people who take it personally. The ledger was entered into evidence in a proceeding that lasted 4 days and produced a verdict that required no deliberation. He was in a penitentiary in Santa Fe. He would be there for the rest of his life, which was the precise amount of time that seemed appropriate given the scope of what the ledger documented. The land had gone back, farm by farm, parcel by parcel. The legal process had taken 8 weeks, and Clara had driven most of it, working from a desk at the back of the courthouse with stacks of federal documents and a methodical patience that left the land records clerk visibly exhausted by comparison. Her parcel was one of the first restored, Henry's parcel, Henry and Clara's parcel. She had stood at the edge of it on the morning the paperwork cleared and looked at the creek boundary and the eastern tree line and the particular quality of the afternoon light on that specific piece of ground that she had looked at with her husband and thought, this is the place. This is where we build something. She had stood there for a while. Then she had turned around and walked back into town because she had a school to finish building. The schoolhouse was on the north end of the main street, where an empty lot had been sitting since a building burned down in 1873. Clara had approached it practically, the way she approached most things. She described what she needed. People arrived to help build it, and it was done in 3 weeks. Plank walls, a good wood stove, a blackboard that Elias had mounted with the care of a man hanging something in a cathedral. 16 children on the first day. Children of every background this valley had managed to accumulate. The children of farmers, and the children of the women who worked the laundry, and the children of the man who ran the Chinese restaurant that had opened in October in the building next to the general store. Clara had gone to each family personally. She had sat in each kitchen and spoken directly to each parent, and the message was the same every time. Your child belongs in this classroom. No exceptions, no categories. Education is not a privilege distributed according to who you are or where you came from. It is a right. Every family sent their children. Silas was another matter. He had not left. That was the first and most significant thing. He had stayed in Hope's End through September and October and into November, which was not something anyone who knew his history would have predicted. He had helped with the cooperative farm's infrastructure in the practical way of a man with specific skills and no need to be thanked for them. He had ridden out twice on matters that nobody asked too many questions about, and both times had come back. He had taken the room above Martha's kitchen, the one with the window that looked south, and he had been in it most mornings when Martha came down to start the stove. He and Clara had not spoken about any of it directly, about what it meant that he stayed, about the mine shaft, or the campfire, or any of the things that had been said in the dark. They spoke about the cooperative farm, and the federal case, and the children coming to school. They spoke at Martha's dinner table, and in the street, and once, memorably, in a long conversation on the steps of the courthouse that lasted until the stars came out, and Martha had to send Cole to tell them. Supper was cold. They were in the careful way of two people who have both been hurt by the speed of things, taking their time. It was a Tuesday morning when Clara came into the schoolhouse and found it empty of children. Lesson was not for another hour. She had come early to prepare, which she always did, because preparation is what makes a thing look effortless even when it isn't. She set her books on the desk. She wrote the day's date on the upper corner of the blackboard. She turned around. Silas was in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands. No duster coat today. Just his work shirt and his dark vest, the silver watch chain catching the morning light through the window. He looked at her, and then at the room around her, the small desks, and the blackboard, and the books, lined up on the shelf she had built herself on a Saturday afternoon with a borrowed hammer. "You're early," she said. "I've been standing outside for 20 minutes, he said, which was not something he would have admitted 6 months ago, which meant something. She looked at him. "Come in." He came in. He walked to the nearest desk. The children's desks, naturally, were too small for him in a way that would have been comical if his face hadn't been so serious. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pulled the chair out and sat down. His knees were up near his chest. She pressed her lips together very carefully and said nothing about that. He put his hat on the desk and looked at his hands. Those big, scarred, calloused hands resting on a small child's writing desk in a morning-lit schoolroom. He turned them over once. "I can't read," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I can track a man across 30 miles of rock, and I can fix an engine, and I know 6 ways to start a fire with no matches. But I never," he stopped. "After Rose died. After everything. There was no time, and then there was no point, and then it was just something I didn't have." She walked to the shelf and took down a piece of chalk. She walked to the blackboard. She drew a line at the bottom. "Waist height for a child. Chest height for her. Come here," she said. He unfolded himself from the desk. It took a moment. He came to stand beside her at the blackboard. She held out the chalk. He took it. It sat between his thumb and forefinger, the way a thing does when you're not sure what angle it wants to be held at. He adjusted it. His hand was very still, which was not easy for a hand that knew how to be steady with far more dangerous things, but was having to learn what steadiness meant in this context. "Your name," she said. "Let's start there." She showed him the letters, one at a time, not quickly, not with impatience, in the way she showed every child everything, which was with the understanding that learning is not a race, and there is no version of it that it is. The person teaching you believes completely in the person learning. She believed completely. He watched her hand make the shapes, and then he made them himself. The chalk dragged and caught on the board, and the first letters were uncertain things, leaning in different directions, like they hadn't decided where to stand. He wiped them off with his palm and did it again. The second attempt was steadier. The third was steadier still. S-I-L-A. As he stepped back from the board, he looked at what he had written. His name, the word for who he was, standing on the blackboard in his own hand, in chalk that was already becoming real and ordinary, and his. He stood with the chalk loose in his fingers and looked at it. Clara looked at him. What happened in his face in that moment was not a dramatic thing. It was not the breaking open of something or the dramatic resolution of 10 years of grief. It was quieter than that. The face of a man who has picked up something very light and discovered that it has more weight than he expected, and that the weight is not bad, that it is, in fact, the exact weight a thing should have when it finally belongs to you. He turned and looked at her. Genuine, open, the unburdened, unguarded face that she had glimpsed in the mine shaft and had been seeing more of, in the spaces between other things. Every week since, the face that existed behind all the other faces. He smiled, not the almost smile, not the controlled near thing she had been watching break through the armor for months. A real one, full and unguarded and warm and entirely without apology. It was, she thought, the most dangerous thing she had ever seen him do. She took the chalk back from his hand. Her fingers closed around his for a moment and stayed. Again, she said, the whole alphabet this time. He looked at the blackboard, at the full length of it, stretching wall to wall, holding everything there was left to learn. "That's a lot of letters," he said. "It is," she agreed. "We have time." And they did. They had the morning and the afternoon and the weeks ahead of that, and the particular kind of time that belongs to two people who have already survived everything the worst version of their lives could produce and have arrived. Finally, on the other side of it. A town doesn't heal all at once. People don't either. It happens the way the cooperative farm grew, which is to say slowly and through attention and through the daily choice. To show up and do the work even on the days when the work is hard and the results aren't visible yet. Freedom is not a single moment. It is a practice, a daily, ordinary, sometimes exhausting decision to live like a person who deserves it. Education is the same thing. It is the decision, made again and again, that the world inside a book or on a blackboard belongs to you as much as it belongs to anyone. That your name in chalk is as real and as permanent and as worthy of space as any other name. Outside, Hope's End was waking up. The sound of it came through the schoolhouse window. Colpham calling something across the street. The cooperative farm wagon going past. Heavy and useful. Martha's rooster, who had survived the fire and was very clear about his continuing relevance. Somewhere, Elias's hammer, beginning its day the way it always did, with the honest and certain sound of something being built. Silas picked up the chalk. He wrote the first letter, then the next, careful and slow, and getting steadier with every stroke. The morning light came in, long and warm, across the blackboard. Clara stood beside him and watched him write, and she thought about all the things it had taken to get to this room. The saloon floor, and the mine shaft, and the burning building, and the blood in the dirt, and the train. Whistle splitting the morning, and the chain hitting the ground, and all the long, dark miles in between. Worth it, she thought. Every single one. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality. And so when we look back on the road Clara Dalton walked, we realize this was never only a story about a stolen deed, a corrupt sheriff, or one outlaw cowboy standing against a town full of fear. It was a story about what happens when one person refuses to accept silence as the price of survival. Clara entered Dust Creek as a widow with bruises on her body and grief in her heart. But she carried something stronger than pain. She carried the stubborn belief that truth still mattered, even in a place where men had learned to lower their eyes and call cowardice wisdom. Silas Thorne, too, was more than the shadow people whispered about. He was a man wounded by loss, shaped by guilt, and convinced that his scars made him dangerous to anyone who came too close. Yet through Clara's courage, and through the quiet loyalty he gave her, without asking for reward, he learned that a broken life is not the same as a wasted one. Sometimes the people who have suffered the most are the ones who understand justice best, because they know exactly what it costs when justice is denied. This story reminds us that evil often survives not because it is stronger than good, but because good people become afraid to move. In that saloon, Clara was not defeated by Kincaid's boot, nearly as much as she was wounded by the silence around her. That silence was the real enemy. It lived in every man who looked away, every neighbor who decided safety mattered more than decency, every citizen who forgot that a town is not made of buildings, but of people willing to stand for one another. And yet the story also shows us that shame can become a beginning. One bucket lifted at the burning boarding house became a line of hands. One locked well broken open became a symbol of freedom. One ledger pulled from hiding became a voice for the dead. One woman's refusal to run became the spark that reminded an entire town who they used to be. That is the deepest lesson this story leaves behind. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is feeling the fear, knowing the danger is real, and still choosing to do what is right. Clara was afraid. Silas was afraid of losing again, of failing again, of opening his heart again. Martha was afraid. Elias had lived with fear and silence for years, but each of them chose, in their own way, to step forward. And when they did, Dust Creek changed. Not all at once, not like magic, but the way real healing happens. One honest act, one open hand, one hard truth, one morning of work after another. Hope's End did not become free because one gunfighter saved it. It became free because the people finally understood that freedom cannot be handed down by a hero. It must be practiced by a community. The open schoolhouse at the end is just as important as the fall of Kincaid, because it shows what justice is truly for. Justice is not only punishment for the wicked, it is the chance for children to learn without fear. It is land returned to the hands that earned it. It is a blacksmith's hammer building instead of hiding. It is a former outlaw writing his own name for the first time and realizing that his future still belongs to him. That final image of Silas standing at the blackboard tells us that redemption is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is a man holding a piece of chalk, learning the letters of his own name, while the woman who believed in him stands beside him. In the end, this story asks every audience member a simple but powerful question. When wrong is happening in front of you, will you look away or will you stand? Clara's answer changed a town. Silas' answer changed his life. And perhaps that is why their story stays with us, long after the dust settles. Because deep down, we all know there are moments when the world does not need perfect people. It needs willing people. People brave enough to tell the truth. People steady enough to protect the weak. People humble enough to heal, learn, and begin again. Dust Creek was once a place where hope seemed finished. But by the end, it became Hope's end for a better reason. Not because hope died there, but because hope finally